Hi, everyone. So this week we're going to be talking about Pacific Islanders and Arab and Middle Eastern experiences and communities. We're going to unsettle some of the ways that we've been talking about colonialism and colonial power. We've traditionally talked about the US government and white supremacy as a culprit being enacted by white people against people of color. In this first section, we're going to be thinking about Indigenous people or First Nations people and settlers of color. When we look at the Hawaiian Islands in particular, and many of the other island nations, we have to think about the ways in which people of color come into what is a already established, flourishing nation of people and become a part of the colonial violence that exists there. We have it here in the United States, in the mainland of the United States, but we also see it quite strikingly in Hawaii. So we're going to think about the way in which that is manifest through our reading. So we have Nani K. Trask. She passed away in 2021. She was a Native Hawaiian activist, poet, academic, activist, educator, and writer. She helped to found the field of Hawaiian studies and press for Indigenous sovereignty. She completed her BA, MA, and PhD, I believe, in political science, all at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she's quoted as saying, "We will die as Hawaiians. We will never die. We will never be Americans." So her activism has worked to get recognition for Indigenous or First Nations Hawaiians people outside of the colonial power that is the United States. So this article, Settlers of Color and Immigrant Hegemony, interrogates the ways in which Asian populations who are now a major political power on the Hawaiian Islands or in the Hawaiian Islands and these different kind of distinct identities. So there's three identities at play here in this piece. There is actually four. So there is the First Nations people, the indigenous Hawaiian people, the native people of the land. There's the immigrant Asian populations who are brought there to work on sugar plantations. Their children who have coined and politicized the identifier local. And then there's the Ha'oles, which are the white colonizing people, or the white colonizer. So these four groups of people are at play in the political struggle and the recognition of First Nations people as indigenous people on the island and the ways in which people of color has been both disadvantaged and discriminated against and experienced violence in the colonial process from the colonizer, but have also benefited from the dispossession of land of indigenous people. I want to go over the term sovereignty with you. It's the authority to govern yourself. We've talked about this before. It's independence or self-governance. So there's federal sovereignty when a federal government is powered or gains power by its citizens, the voting power. There's state government, state sovereignty, where state governments gain power from their federal government. And then there's tribal government sovereignty, which derives sovereign power from the people and from its connection to the ancestral lands. It is the right to your own government, to determine its membership and its citizenship, to make and enforce laws, to regulate trade within borders, and to form alliances with other nations. A sovereignty is the internationally recognized right of a nation to govern itself. Most of these terms are straightforward. There is a history of the annexation, specifically of the Hawaiian Islands. To annex means to append or add a territory to. So the U.S. adds Hawaii and Alaska to its territories. Hawaii was annexed in 1898. But the US had attempted or had actually done an illegal overthrow of the Queen of Hawaii in 1893. The US spent many years trying to annex Hawaii and eventually is successful in 1898. So I want us to be clear on the immigrant population that we're talking about are Asian populations, primarily Japanese, but we're also talking about Chinese and Filipino Asian groups who are the first people who immigrate to the Hawaiian Islands. Their immigration status is tied to servitude on plantations or plantation labor. Their offspring, the generations that come after that first group, are called locals. They experience the racial discrimination that Asian people experience from the United States, and they are politically advantaged over First Nations people. And again, the Aholes are the white colonizers. We've talked about the model minority myth in great detail. I want to remind you again that the model minority myth is specifically about Asian people, and it's used against people of color. In the Hawaiian Islands, it's this expectation that Asian Americans as a group are individually smart, hardworking, docile, submissive, obedient, and uncomplaining, spiritually enlightened, and in never need of assistance. They are a shining example of overcoming discrimination. That's a general idea about the model minority myth. It's posited as Asians as a monolith and a minority group that is overcoming the odds, and they're used to suggest that people of color, so on the mainland, it's was used in the civil rights movement to say Black people and brown people, primarily Black people, should be able to achieve what Asians have been able to achieve. On the Hawaiian Islands, it's wielded against the First Nations people of Hawaii. I'm going to talk a little bit about the power sharing in a couple minutes, so I'll come back to that. Identity politics is another one that comes up in the reading, so I want you to be clear on what that means. Think of it as an effort of seeing yourself or your group identity in society or in government or state politics. So you push for the development of political agendas based on a group identity. It can be racial, it can be nationality or ethnicity, it can be religion, it can be class, etc. So I want you to understand identity politics is a shared group identity that strives for recognition from state and federal governments. All right, most of these are pretty straightforward. For what is the utility of the power sharing propaganda? First of all, remember, let me go back. So what the local nation identifier does is that it allows for Asian people to position themselves outside of the colonial power and posit this position of place as not a native to Hawaii, but a local, someone who belongs there. So it's a claim for placehood. She writes that as First Nation folks organize themselves, they're perceived as a threat by Asians or locals because they are benefactors of the dispossession of Native people. So the dispossession of their lands and of their resources that are tied to the land. Asian people are benefiting from that. The local identifier allows Asians to distance themselves from the violence of settler colonialists while also staking a claim to their place on the Hawaiian Islands, so that they are not responsible for the dispossession of First Nations people, even though they're benefiting from it. So when we say that when the question, how does statehood come to be for Asian populations? If you look at page 189, she writes, it's the one, two, three, fourth full paragraph down. Part of this denial is the substitution of the term local for immigrant, which is itself a particularly celebrated American gloss for settler. So that just means that when the US talks about being a nation of immigrants, not talking about the immigration policies that disproportionately affect brown folks at the southern border. But when the United States talks about being a nation of settlers, what they are talking about is being a nation of immigrants. What they're talking about is being settlers, settler colonialist. So she's asserting that the moniker of immigrant in that context is already glossing over the violence of settler colonialism, right? To say we're a nation of immigrants suggests that, one, there was nobody there, and that those people weren't dispossessed of their lands and their resources. They didn't experience violence, right? When we talk about settler colonialism and understand what settler colonialism is, then there's a different context that goes along with that. So if we say we're a nation of immigrants, you remove that particular history, you erase that or gloss over that history. She's saying that in Hawaii, the immigrant, which is already glossing over the settlers, then takes up another name, another title, another way of identifying themselves called locals. As on the continent, the mainland, so in our island home, settlers and their children recast the American tale of nationhood. Hawaii is like the continent. It is naturalized as but another telling illustration of the uniqueness of America's nation of immigrants. Ideologically, the ideology weaves a story of success. Poor Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino settlers supplied the labor for wealthy white sugar planters during the long period of the territory, the 1900 to 1959. Exploitative plantation, remember that term when we've talked about the different forms of colonialism? Exploitative colonialism was one of the different forms of colonialism. So exploitative plantation conditions thus underpins the master narrative of hard work and an endless celebrated triumph over anti-Asian racism. So the local moniker says that we were people who were brought here under these harsh conditions. We worked very hard and we were able to triumph over anti-Asian racism. Settler children, ever industrious and deserving, obtain technical and liberal educations, thereby learning the political system through which they agitate the full voting rights of American citizens. Politically, the vehicle for Asian ascendancy is statehood. So what she's arguing is that the term local allows for an erasure of the violence that Asian populations have inflicted upon indigenous populations, the ways in which they benefit from the dispossession of indigenous people, and the discrimination of indigenous people, and how their ascendancy, they're being allowed to become educated in technical and liberal degrees to gain political power, has been a way in which they become a part of the state. They become core members of that society, and no longer immigrant populations, but local communities. So they are outside of that. They created insider status as opposed to being outside or immigrants. The utility of the power sharing propaganda. I want you to be clear about that one as well. The power sharing propaganda structures a discourse about their electoral system or political system that is shared, so that all people of color have the same kind of access at the same time. We think about democracy in the same way here. And that if First Nations people are not being successful politically, it's not because of the ways in which white supremacy has made space for Asian populations to, on that island, to gain political power, but because of the ineptitude of Indigenous people, that it is because of their inability to be successful, their inherent incapability, that they're not achieving. It has nothing to do with the systems and structures in place. That's what the power sharing propaganda does. That's how it's being utilized. It's being utilized to frame a inept First Nations people by saying that the power is shared across all people of color, and Native people have to earn their right to be a part of it, and that they're just not earning their right. And then the last one, 12, again, I explained that, but if you read on 192, you'll see again that it is a marker that separates Asian people from the colonizers, from the group of people who colonized the white colonizer, while simultaneously putting them above a status of immigrant, giving them a natural place of belonging on the Hawaiian Islands, while simultaneously dispossessing Indigenous or First Nations people. Other than that, these were all pretty straightforward. So I'm going to go on to your next video.